These are my parents, Leslie and Philip Talbot. This is them on their wedding day. You'll notice the date, 2nd of November 1939. They were one of the many, many couples who rushed to get married at the start of the Second World War. They were extremely ill-suited, I have to say, but they were happy. And they met when Mum was 17 and Dad was 20. And Dad was on a boat, just a rowboat on the river, and he'd seen 2 twin boys, aged about 4, and he'd offered them a lift, and they'd said, "Oh yes, please," and came on. And my mother, who was 17, was supposed to be looking after them, but you know what 17-year-olds are like. She suddenly thought, where are they? And there they were, with these strange men, my father and his brother, in this boat. And she stood on the bank saying, "You bring those boys back!" And my father said he looked at her and saw the woman he was going to marry. He was brave, wasn't he? She just walked off, and he went around knocking on doors saying, "Do you know a family with a 17-year-old girl with 2 twin brothers and a red setter?" And he eventually found her. Nothing if not persistent, my dad. So this is them 50 years later, almost, in their garden. They absolutely adored their garden. And their marriage, they were married in the end 61 years, and they had 4 children. They weathered the World War. They had all the ups and downs of a successful marriage. But after this was taken, quite a while, about 10 years after this was taken, Dad was doing his bit, going down to the shop. He always wore his hat and carried his bag, and he always worked out which shop had the cheapest, whatever it was he wanted, and then he'd go back and boast to my mother. And anyone else would have clocked him. After all, she'd been shopping for 50 years, but she was only too glad that he was doing the shopping. But this time he went off to the shop, and people thought he had tripped over the curb, but he hadn't tripped over the curb. He'd had a massive stroke, and Dad became demented overnight. So he had vascular dementia, and it was dreadful for the family. You can imagine becoming demented overnight. So he went into hospital, but it was quite clear that the hospital wasn't going to keep him because there was nothing they could do for him. And they arranged for him to go into a home, and he absolutely hated it, and we all hated it. Mum was desperately trying to get him back. We just didn't know what to do. And that business of what happens when you come out of hospital, I don't think we've got a handle on that. Possibly you've had a similar sort of experience. But eventually Mum said she couldn't stand it anymore, and she took him home. And so she cared for him at home for 2 years, which was not easy. He was doubly incontinent. He couldn't interact at all. Eventually, Mum's doctor said to me, "He's going into a home because your mum won't last another month." So Dad went into a home, it's interesting because although he couldn't interact, I suspect now, looking back, that he had much more understanding than we gave him credit for. He once said to me quite lucidly, "I don't like being sidelined here," and it nearly broke my heart. And I suspect that he actually, these days, I hope things may have got a little bit better, and we're talking about 20 years ago now. But I really think that more could have been done for Dad. But he died in 2000, and in 1999, the year before he died, Mum was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And that was, again, an experience some of you here might have had. It was obvious that her memory had been going downhill for a long time. I remember going to stay with them, and this involved going to the station and then walking over a bridge and going to the car park. And as I walked over the bridge, I saw Mum get exasperated and drive off, and I thought, well, she must have known that I couldn't have got to her in that time. And it was then that it became obvious that something had happened. So we were in denial for about 2 years, I think, before Mum was finally accepted as having Alzheimer's. There's something I meant to say when I was talking about Dad. The thing about Dad is he didn't have an enduring power of attorney, a lasting power of attorney it's now called. This was a complete disaster. You must make sure that you or anyone you care for, if they're not too far down the road, has a lasting power of attorney. Dad had to be made a ward of the Court of Protection, and I had to become his receiver under the Court of Protection. And it's a nightmare. The Court of Protection doesn't understand decimal points. So I would ask for £100 and I'd be given a court order 2 months later for £1,000 or £10 or so. I mean, it was ridiculous. And I'd then have to go back and get another court order. It was, to add insult to injury, I think is all I'm going to say about that. So make sure you get a power of attorney. Mum, what to do with Mum? Because here she was living on her own, which is something, funny enough, she'd always wanted to do, but she couldn't enjoy it. She was deteriorating quite rapidly. And I went to look at homes, and some of you may have already looked at homes. Some of the homes, well, because she had a diagnosis of dementia, I had to look for nursing homes, not residential homes, and looking at them just frightened me to death. At the time I had very little experience of dementia. I hadn't actually hands-on cared for Dad. Mum had been doing that. And I just couldn't put my mother into such a place. And so in the end I decided that she should come and live with me. And so that was a bit of a nightmare, selling her house, selling my house, moving into another house. But when she came, it was wonderful. It was so much easier knowing that she was warm, well-fed, happy. I knew where she was. I mean, when she was living at home, I used to ring up and she didn't answer, and so I'd immediately think of her lying at the bottom of the garden. You know, she had one of these things, but she always forgot it. So quite often she'd not have it on if something had gone wrong. And then she'd be absolutely fine. But of course, I was worrying all the time. Caring from a distance is no fun. It was much easier when she was with me, and at first we had a lovely time. We went to friends. There's somebody there who used to have my mum to dinner parties, and we did things like we went to the sing-along with Sound of Music, which I recommend. I can't believe I'm recommending it, but I do recommend it. It was great fun. We went to a Buckingham Palace dinner party. But I can see you all thinking this isn't going to last, and sadly, of course, it didn't. And as Mum deteriorated, she stopped being able to entertain herself. So first off, she could read books, but then she couldn't read books. I noticed that she'd pick up the same book at the same place every day. And then she would read newspapers, but she would read the same bit out to me in exactly the same voice, over and over and over again. I learnt to cope with that one, actually, because I learnt that if I responded in exactly the same way, in exactly the same tone of voice every time, she was quite happy. She thought we were having a conversation. But because I didn't have to think about my reply, I was able to carry on doing whatever I was doing, reading or whatever. But I know it can drive people mad, that repetition. We had lots of little incidents, like there was the time I couldn't get her out of the bath. So it was cold. She was in the bath and I just couldn't get her out. We tried turning her round so she could push herself. And I was thinking, what do I do now? Ring social services? Do I ring the ambulance? Do I ring the police? What? And I kept warming towels and taking them into her, and it was very frightening. Eventually we did get her out. But it was getting harder and harder for me. I was working full-time throughout all this. I meant to change this, by the way. That's Mum when she was 17, and that's Mum when she came to live with me. So that was Mum at the time. It was getting harder and harder. I had rung the council at the beginning and said, I understand I'm due a carers assessment. And the chap said to me, well, you are, but there's no point because we haven't got any money. So I thought, well, okay, I'm not going to waste my time. And so I didn't get a carers assessment until I was 2 years into Mum's living with me. Don't make that mistake. because actually I didn't discover I was entitled to 6 weeks respite care. So I hadn't had any respite care. Mum had been living with me for 3 years and I hadn't had any respite care. I was nearly on my knees. And she went to respite care and they said, don't ring up, she'll be absolutely fine, you go off and enjoy yourself, which is what I did. But it was a disaster. When she came back, she couldn't stop crying, she was frightened of the baths, I don't know what had gone wrong. And of course, I never knew what had gone wrong. I tried to complain, but complaining, you can imagine trying to look after Mum, who was still crying all the time, impossible to put her to bed at night because she was frightened, she wouldn't have a bath. I mean, it was just awful. 1 week of respite, and it put me back by at least 6 weeks. Also, at that time, I had been given direct payments and had to employ 6 carers. Now, they all worked part-time, and I was working, I don't have a set timetable, so setting out the rota each week was a really difficult task. And I was also having to pay these people, and I was having to do their tax and national insurance, and one of them was trying to get pregnant. God help me, I was encouraging her, completely unaware that I would have to pay maternity pay and all this sort of thing. One has to become an employer as well as looking after somebody with dementia. And I remember one night I was sitting looking at my computer trying to work out the tax situation. And I just thought, I don't understand a word of this. There were tears pouring down my cheek. I was desperately worried that I was getting it all wrong. And eventually I went to one of the carers and I said, would you look after Mum these mornings? And she said, I'm sorry, Marianne, I can't get your Mum up anymore. She hates getting up. And indeed she did. I remember once I was putting her sock on and I looked up just as she purposely kicked me. She kicked me in the face. And I was just so furious. I got up, I went out of the room and I slammed the door because I would have hit her. I just... you don't do what you're doing for thanks, but you don't want to be kicked in the face either. And people forget that, they say, oh, it's the disease, it's not her fault, she's not doing this. And that's all true, and of course one accepts that. But if one is the person being kicked, that's not what you're thinking of. It can be a very, very difficult thing caring for somebody with dementia. But it's not all doom and gloom. People often ask me, was your mum still herself? Actually, I think she was, right up until the time she died. I think she was still herself. She was still open to everything, up for everything. She would laugh a lot. We would laugh a lot together. We'd do washing up together and sing together and things like that. And I remember once that my younger brother walked in. My mum can always recognise me, although she thought I was her mum. She didn't recognise me as her daughter, she recognised me as someone. But my younger brother walked in, and she threw her arms around his neck and said to me, I don't know who he is, but I know I love him. So there were lots of very heartwarming moments. And when Carol said she couldn't look after Mum, I started crying and I couldn't stop. I couldn't stop. The doctor had to be called, Valium was given. I recommend Valium. And Mum was taken away. She stayed with my aunt and uncle in Kent for a while, and then she went into a home for the final 6 months of her life, which was a really good thing. I should have sent her to a home earlier because it was good for her, it was good for me, and it was much, much easier for that final stage when things were so very difficult. And 2 weeks before she died, I didn't know that this was 2 weeks before she died. I walked in, she looked at me, and she held my cheek, and she said, "You're a lovely person," she said, "sweetie pie." And then 2 weeks later, she unexpectedly died. But I value so much that final bit of lucidity. So, there'll be lots of people here who are starting on their own journey, either living with dementia. For you, I can say that the thing about Alzheimer's in particular is that a lot of people with Alzheimer's have no insight. Mum thought she was caring for me, and she was happy, pretty much right to the end. I mean, she continued to enjoy life, she continued to enjoy food, so hang on to that. And if you're embarking on the journey caring, there are so many things out there for you these days that weren't there when I started. Use Carers UK, use Age UK, use Alzheimer's Research UK, they can tell you all sorts of useful things. There is a lot of help out there, you are not on your own. And I'm going to leave it there.